So my name is Scout Kirby, and I am a wildlife educator and AmeriCorps with the Nevada Department of Wildlife. And today we are going to again be talking about elusive animals in Nevada. So for those who have not seen the previous programs, this is a part of a series where I am focusing on some of our more elusive species in Nevada and how you can go out and find them and where to look for them. So the previous presentations have focused on different adaptations that make our animals more elusive, and the adaptations we're going to focus on today are going to be in regards to our animals' activity patterns. So to recap real quick, our last program. So last time we focused on the social and habitat preferences of our animals. And our main finding was that limited or isolated habitats or resources in Nevada are going to make the animals that depend on those habitats and resources more elusive. And then another thing we talked about was in regards to social preferences, animals can become even more elusive if they are a solitary species or also if they are territorial. So keep in mind those adaptations as we're going to still be touching on them in addition to new ones today. And then previously I went over how to use the iNaturalist app, which again, I'm just going to go over a brief bit about what the app does and then kind of give you a tutorial on how you can follow along with the different animals I'm focusing on today. So iNaturalist is a citizen science project that is between the California Academy of Sciences and National Geographic Society. And basically what it is they want people to go out into nature and observe different things. So take pictures of plants and animals, whatever you can find on there, and then upload them to their app where you can identify them, or if you need help, other naturalists and even scientists can help you identify your findings. And then that can be used as a resource for people who in the future want to look back and see where different observations of different species have occurred in Nevada. So today I'm going to be focusing on the web page with iNaturalist just because it has a lot more accessible information on there compared to the apps. So the main web page for Nevada on iNaturalist is going to be at this link right here. Here I can put on this pointer. It's going to be at this link right up here, so it should say Nevada. I believe if you just Google iNaturalist in Nevada, it should be the first thing that pops up. But this is just the overall page showing all the observations that have occurred in Nevada. So you can see there are 4,119 species listed in Nevada, but only 3,213 have been confirmed. So there's way more animals and plants out there than what we can even go out and confirm. So definitely be using this advice and all these resources when you're going out and looking for these species. But if you want to follow along, you can go down and click on this amphibians button in the menu. So this shows you all the different animals that are in Nevada, or also the plants as well, so you can click on those. If you click on the amphibians, it'll take you to this page that is specific to our amphibians in Nevada. So then to help you with following along, if you so choose to today, one of the species I'm going to cover is the Great Basin Spadefoot toad. So if you click on that species and open its species profile in a new tab, it'll take you to this page, which is specific to the Spadefoot toad. Right now, though, it is specific to all iNaturalist observations. So these are all iNaturalist observations throughout its native range and not just in Nevada. So if you go to this box right up here and do filter by place, you can change it to Nevada, US, and then you'll get all the observations just within our state. So that's the information that I'm going to be using today. And specifically, you'll be seeing these seasonality maps on the different species highlights that I do. And then you'll also, if you scroll down, you can see the big map, which for what I like to do, it's a little bit messy. So I'm going to go to this map setting and turn off the terrain, and that way it'll make it just a nice flat page. And then if you go over here to this little layered image, you can turn off the range map. And that'll give you a map that's much cleaner and easier to look at, like this one. So this is what my maps that I'm using today are going to look like. And the different colors mean different things. So counties that are green are counties where that species is listed, and it also has been observed in that county. Meanwhile, counties that are yellowish orange are the ones that have that species listed, but there haven't been any iNaturalist observations of that species. And then the little red squares are each individual observation that has been submitted to iNaturalist. And then just to make sure, is everything okay with my speaker? Because I have a little exclamation point on my audio saying my speaker isn't working. So Amanda, if you can come on real quick and just tell me.
To me, you sound fine.
Okay, then I'm just gonna ignore that little thing. But let me know if anyone submits a question or anything saying that they can't hear or something.
Yeah, everyone else
Oh,
is
wait.
saying you sound fine too, but I will keep you up to date if anything changes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all. All right, so today we are going to be focusing on the activity patterns that are going to make our animals more elusive. And overall, we're just going to be always going back to that main theme that Nevada is a really diverse state. It's just going to be harder to view its diversity because of the way the state's laid out and the way the resources are distributed. Our wildlife populations are going to be harder to view for some species. So what are activity patterns? This refers to when animals are going to be active and for how long. So different animals will be out during different times of the day. They'll also use either longer bursts of activity or shorter bursts of activity. And sometimes their activity patterns change with the seasons or even just on a daily basis. So we have nocturnal species in Nevada, like this bushy-tailed pack rat. And nocturnal means they're going to be primarily out at nighttime, although as you can see in this picture on the right, this guy is out during the day. So even though we have strict definitions to these terms, our animals aren't going to necessarily abide by those definitions. So if there are plenty of resources or there's something going on that they feel safe enough going out during a time of the day that they normally wouldn't, then they'll do that. But we also are going to have animals that are crepuscular. So that means they're primarily active around dawn and dusk, like this common nighthawk. And this guy specifically is going to be active at this time because of the bugs that it's going to be out feeding on at this time. And crepuscular animals have this nice little transition zone between diurnal and nocturnal animals, diurnal being animals that are awake during the day. So they don't have to deal with the competition from those two different groups. So during the day, there'll be animals like swallows that'll be out catching bugs that the nighthawk would have to compete with. And at nighttime, there's going to be things like bats that are out catching them. So at this crepuscular time, that's when they're going to experience the least amount of competition. So some animals will take advantage of that activity pattern. Others, like this golden mantled ground squirrel, are going to be diurnal, so primarily active during the day. Though during the day in Nevada, it tends to get pretty hot and it's pretty dry. So even our animals that are out during the day aren't going to be super active, or when they are, they're just going to have really short bursts of activity, and that's so that they can conserve their energy and they don't get heat stressed. And then also to avoid predators. But some animals, like this golden mantled ground squirrel, are actually true hibernators, which I'll explain what that means later. So they're going to become inactive during the coldest parts of the year, and they're also going to be underground at that time as well. So you're not going to be able to view them during those times of the year. And different animals, depending on the conditions, are going to become inactive like that. So a lot of our reptiles and amphibians are also going to become inactive during colder weather. So like this regal ring-necked snake, they go into a reptile form of hibernation, which we call brumation, and I'll explain more about that in a little bit as well. And then we also have species like our desert iguanas, which they are considered one of the most heat-tolerant species in North America. But even still, during the hottest times of the year and hottest times of the day, they are going to go into aestivation, which is a thing that animals use when it's really hot in order to conserve their energy. But they'll seek shade, they'll seek cooler spots, and become pretty inactive, so you're not going to be able to see them during those times. So all these different activity patterns can make our animals more elusive, especially if their specific activity patterns don't align with the normal human activity patterns. So some nocturnal and crepuscular adaptations. The ones that are going to make our animals very elusive are their excellent sense of detection. So our animals are going to use a variety of different senses, and sometimes they'll use multiple in order to get information about their surroundings. But when they do this, that means they're going to be more easily able to detect things like predators as well as humans. And so it's going to make it a lot harder for us to find them. So for example, we have desert tarantulas, which are primarily going to be active around nighttime, and they are going to be relying on their sense of touch and using vibrations. So when they are in their burrows, like down here, they're going to set up webbing all along their tunnels, and then they're going to create this little kind of webbing welcome mat, so that if anything comes and steps on that welcome mat, it'll send vibrations down the tunnels. And that way the spider can gather information and determine whether it's predator or prey and what it should do. Other animals like this western shovel-nosed snake are going to also be relying on touch, but they do it a little bit differently. So these guys are going to have all these receptors that are along their bellies, and they're also going to be on the sides and on the underside of their face. And that way they can pick up different vibrations in the ground, and those are going to be processed through their inner ear bone. So instead of hearing auditory noises, our snakes are actually more so going to be hearing vibrations. So their sense of touch and their sense of hearing is kind of coupled in that way. But it's especially important for burrowing species because as soon as they feel your vibrations, they can then hide out as soon as possible. Hearing is also very important though, especially at nighttime when a lot of times it's going to be really dark and there's going to be more noise than there is going to be light. So an example of an animal with really great hearing is our desert kit fox, which is actually the smallest species of fox in North America. And their ears are about 1/5 of their total body length. So they are a very large portion of their body. And part of the reason for that is to take in as much sound as possible. So they're really large. They're also facing forward and more cup-shaped, and that way they can take in more sounds. But also when when desert kit foxes are out during the day, it's also important to have these longer elongated structures so that they can help dissipate heat. And that way that animal isn't going to get heat stress during the day. We also have amphibians and reptiles that can have really good sense of vision. So for example, our frogs and toads has recently been discovered, I believe in 2017, that frogs and toads actually have some of the best night vision in the animal kingdom. They can actually see colors in absolute darkness, which is not possible in regards to other animals. Not many can do that. So that's really special, and especially you can tell that their eyes are important because they're so large on their faces. They're also kind of on the sides of their heads so that they can see almost all the way around them in all directions. So that's going to really help with detection. And then smell is also super important. So we have things like spotted skunks, which are one of the smallest species in North America, but they are not the smallest. They're still super cute and super stinky though. But skunks are going to have a much better sense of smell than humans, and that's going to help them to get around at nighttime, mostly when they're looking for food like bugs and grubs that they're going to dig for in the ground. But also a fun fact about skunks is that it's been thought that they don't like their spray, the smell of their spray either. So actually they tend to not spray other skunks, and they also tend to not spray near their dens. So that way they don't have to deal with it. So now moving on to some diurnal adaptations. A lot of our diurnal animals that are more elusive are going to use really hardy shelters to protect them from the heat and harsh temperatures during the day, as well as how dry it is. And they're also going to utilize shorter bursts of activity so that they can avoid heat stress and then also predation as well. So for example, we have long-tailed brush lizards, which as you can see, they blend in really well with their sandy kind of wooded environment. And they use that kind of method disguise camouflage where they'll line themselves up on the bark of trees to help them blend in, and that way predators will go by without noticing them. But they are going to become less active during the hottest parts of the day as they're going to go into that estivation stage, which I'll explain in a little bit. And then in the winter too, they're going to go into brumation. So they're not going to be active throughout the year, and especially if they are going to be a diurnal species and they can't deal with those hot temperatures, they're going to have to become inactive. So we also have Palmer's chipmunks. They are diurnal, but they are also going to go into hibernation during the coldest months of the year. And even during the summer months, they're going to use those really short bursts of activity because one, chipmunks are a really tasty meal for a lot of different predators, so they need to make sure they're not staying out for too long. That way they can get captured. But also they're going to be running around trying to defend their territory as well as gather food to store for winter, and then also maybe improve their hibernation burrows a little bit. So they're going to be doing a bunch of different things. They're just going to be doing them in shorter bursts because they don't want to heat stress themselves, and they also don't want to be at risk of predation. And then long-tailed weasels are a species that is actually going to be active all year long, and it doesn't go into hibernation. So during the year, it's going to be, or during the summer, it's going to be primarily active towards nighttime. So that is when it's going to be blending in a little bit better with its darker coloration. Whereas in the wintertime, they're going to be primarily diurnal. And that's because they go through this coat change where their fur is going to change from those darker brown colors to this really nice white color. They'll still retain that kind of black mark on the edge of their tail though most of the time. But during the winter time, a lot of their prey, which is small mammals, if they're still awake and not hibernating, they're more likely to be active during the warmer parts of the day. So the weasel is going to shift its activity patterns to follow its prey, and a lot of animals are going to do that. So now to get into hibernation and torpor. So hibernation is going to be a long-term drop in body temperature and metabolic rate. And for most mammals that go through hibernation, their body processes drop by about 98%. So some animals will only take about 2 to 3 breaths per minute when they're hibernating, and they're going to be really, really cold, like tiny little popsicles. So things like this Belding's ground squirrel, these pallid bats, as well as groundhogs are going to be true hibernators in Nevada. And one common misconception about hibernation is that a lot of times people think it's caused by cold temperatures or that there's less food available, but actually it's going to be caused by changes in day length, which are going to trigger hormone changes. So changes in day length, or day length is sometimes referred to as photoperiod. These changes as the days get shorter are going to trigger in their pituitary gland the HIT hormone, which is a hibernation inducement trigger. And that's going to send that animal into hibernation mode, essentially. So it's really cool. If you take an animal that is going through that hibernation phase and has that HIT hormone in its bloodstream, and you take that animal's blood and inject it into another animal that is not in hibernation phase, that animal will then enter hibernation phase and will start going through the same thing as the animal that you just put its blood in. But another thing that's going to be triggered via these HIT hormones is hyperphagia. So hyper means a lot, and phagia is referring to food. So our hibernators are going to be eating a lot of food when they're getting ready to go into hibernation, that they can build up fat stores. Also, some animals like our ground squirrels will even go out and store food and cache it in these little burrows that they create. Which brings me to my next point. The burrows and dens that are specific to hibernation are going to be a little bit different than our animals' normal dens, and they are called hibernacula. And these dens tend to be smaller, and that way they can conserve as much heat as possible while the animal is hibernating. All right, so going on to torpor, this is kind of like the short-term version of hibernation. So the animals will go through similar body processes where their temperature drops, their metabolic rate drops, and they're just going to become really inactive and hunker down in their shelter. And that is going to be caused by temperature and food availability. But throughout the day, that can change. So for example, if it's wintertime and it's in the morning, and this little raccoon isn't able to find any food, it can go into torpor until about midday when it's nicer and maybe some snow has melted, and then it can go out and find more food. Later in the day, it might enter back into torpor again to conserve more energy. But overall, our animals are going to do these things so that they can make it through the harshest times of the year and still survive. But other animals that'll go through torpor are things like our striped skunks and also little tiny things like western harvest mice as well. So now brumation, like I said, it's kind of the reptile amphibian version of hibernation. So basically the cold-blooded version. So cold-blooded animals are those whose body temperature is directly impacted by the ambient temperature or the temperature in their environment. So if it gets really cold, our reptiles and amphibians are going to get really cold too. And they don't want to die from that. So instead, they're going to enter a state known as brumation. And in this state, they're going to have the decreased body temperature and metabolic rate. But like that torpor, they can become active when conditions get better. So once temperatures start to rise again, our reptiles will also get more active, as well as the amphibians. And also, a fun fact is that a lot of our reptiles and amphibians are pretty solitary species throughout the year. But wintertime is one of the few times where they will gather in larger groups, and that way they can conserve more heat and have more bodies together in a small burrow. That's much more effective than just brumating all on your own. So then estivation is going to be similar to brumation, but it's caused by hot temperatures and dry conditions. And actually a lot of different kinds of animals can do this, including birds like this dusky-capped flycatcher, also rosy boas and our desert tortoises, as well as lady beetles, which are related to ladybugs. So different insects can do it as well, even some fish, and even some mammals can as well. But just like with brumation and torpor, once the conditions become more favorable, those animals are going to become active again. Another reason why some animals are more elusive in Nevada is they are migrants. So some animals are going to be permanent residents in Nevada, meaning they stay here throughout the year. Other animals are going to move out of the state and move around throughout the year, and that can make them harder to find. And generally, migration is referred to as a movement from one habitat to another in search of better conditions. And a lot of times, the better conditions have to do with more favorable temperatures, more food availability, and things like that. So as you look at this table showing some of the most amazing animal migrations in the world, you can see right down here a species found in Nevada, the monarch butterfly, which is going to undergo the longest insect migration. So looking at this map, the butterflies, or the monarch butterflies that are going to migrate the longest are those that are on the east coast. So east of the Rocky Mountains, our monarch butterflies are going to migrate to Mexico for winter. There it's going to be, the temperatures are going to be nicer, there's going to be more moisture, and there's also going to be more flowering plants for them to feed on. Whereas on the western side of the Rocky Mountains, our butterflies are going to overwinter in Southern California area for the same reasons, because the temperatures are more favorable, there's more food available, and there's also more moisture too. But just to speak to how awesome this migration is on the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, these butterflies have been recorded flying 265 miles in one day. So they are really hardy butterflies and really cool animals. So other animals will go through different kinds of migration. So our mountain quail in Nevada are going to migrate in terms of elevation during the year. So when it gets into be the winter months, there is going to be more snow up in the mountains and there's going to be less food available. And so our mountain quail are going to migrate out altitudinally, meaning they're going to go down the mountains and get closer to our valleys and basins. And some of these birds will migrate about 20 miles altitudinally, so they can undergo quite a bit of movement as well. And different animals are going to migrate in different ways. So we have aerial migrators like our bats, like this fringed bat, for example, and they're generally just going to seek out roosts that have temperatures that are above freezing. So that's really important for these really small mammals. Other animals like this Woodhouse's toad is going to undergo terrestrial migrations. Theirs are more so regarded as seasonal movements. So generally our amphibians are going to live in more drier areas when they're not breeding. And then when they go into their breeding season, they'll migrate towards wetter habitats or breeding pools. We also have kiwi, which is an endangered species, and they are going to use water to migrate. So as adults, they're going to live in lakes like Pyramid Lake, and then when they are going to breed, they will migrate to different streams in order to spawn. And then there's also a variety of ways our animals are going to navigate. So how they get through their migration, they're going to rely on a couple different things. So a lot of our eagles, like our golden eagles and bald eagles, as well as other raptors, are going to rely on things like mountains and using landmarks. Species like our kokanee salmon, which like to spawn in Taylor Creek in South Lake Tahoe, they're going to rely on their sense of smell in order to find their spawning grounds, which it's very uncommon in birds to have a sense of smell, but they have found that homing pigeons are actually able to navigate with smell, so that's super cool. And then there's a lot of different species that are going to navigate using the Earth's magnetic field, including this western tiger salamander, which there are some iNaturalist observations in Nevada, but its native range just barely touches the state. So they're not super common. I don't know if you're going to be able to find those really, but they're down near Vegas. So one of the better known migrations that have been studied have to deal with our birds, and they are also going to rely on that Earth's magnetic field. But there are other things that they do during their migration that we don't necessarily understand, because it's a really complex phenomenon, and there's a lot of different things that we still don't know how to study it. We do know, though, that birds, when they migrate, they're usually looking for better nesting sites, as well as better food sites, so areas where they're going to be able to have more food availability. And like I said, they're going to use that, the Earth's magnetic pole in order to help them navigate. They're also going to use a number of other things, though. So for example, they'll use different landmarks. So some of those might be human structures. They also will be things like lakes and reservoirs and different mountain ranges. Those are going to help them to navigate. So most people think that birds are going to migrate during the day, and that is true of certain species. So hummingbirds, as well as a lot of our raptors and our swallows, are going to migrate during the day, but actually the majority of birds are going to migrate at nighttime. And so two things that they rely on are the position of the setting sun, and then also the positions of our stars. So if you ever want to go out and view bird migrations in Nevada during the fall or in the spring, there are a number of different designated important bird areas in the state. There's about 40, I believe. And usually they are areas around water. So the Lahontan Valley wetlands are a really good spot, Clark County wetlands area down near Lake Mead, and then also some spots up here near Sheldon Wildlife Refuge and Ruby Lake. Those are some really good areas to go view bird migrations during the day. At nighttime, though, why would birds want to migrate? So one would think that maybe there's going to be less predators at night, but still there's going to be things like this little flammulated owl, which can disrupt migrations and get a couple meals out of there. So one of the reasons why we think birds migrate at night is that they are going to lose less heat if they migrate at night. So birds are going to lose heat through their unfeathered legs mostly. And at nighttime, temperatures tend to be a little bit cooler and the air currents tend to stabilize. So it's going to take less energy to migrate at night compared to during the day. And that's especially true in our green heron's case. And then for most birds that migrate at night, like this Townsend's warbler, they're generally going to start their migration around when the sun sets. So like I said earlier, that kind of crepuscular time when there's a transition between the diurnal and nocturnal animals. So everything is a little more calm and stable right then. And usually their migrations are going to peak between midnight and 2 a.m. And people think that nocturnal migrations might be beneficial in that these birds are primarily active during the day. So if they migrate at night, they can then sleep until the morning and then be active that day feeding as well as sleeping. And that way they can replenish their energy and get ready to fly the next night as well. But one really cool thing about our birds' nocturnal migrations is they have calls that are specific to their nocturnal flight. So they're called night flight calls. And they're generally going to be really low in frequency, so they're going to be a lot harder to hear. I'm going to play a clip and you're going to have to really listen closely because they're just these tiny little peeps and buzzes in the background. And generally they're used to help navigate through obstacles and things like that. So really listen closely as I play this Swainson's thrush night flight call. To hear some of that. If not, that just goes to show you how elusive these birds are at nighttime. They're really, really quiet and they're really inconspicuous. So now I'm going to play you, for comparison, the song of the Swainson's thrush when they're going through their breeding season. So it's going to be much louder. If you can hear that kind of swirly, high-pitched noise, that's them singing much louder and being broadcasted on purpose compared to the night flight calls, which are meant to keep them inconspicuous. And then last week, someone asked about how you can find information on some of the rarest birds in Nevada. So real quick, I just wanted to cover some resources that you can use for that. So one really cool resource is eBird. So it's similar to iNaturalist in that you upload observations of different birds, but you're not going to be uploading, information about plants or mammals. It's just specific to birds. But they have these rare bird alerts that you can subscribe to. So they have one that's specific to the state of Nevada. They also have ones that are specific to different counties or provinces. So you can look around and try to find rare birds in more particular areas. Otherwise, you can also subscribe to their ABA rarities alerts, which they have a grading scale in terms of how they are going to measure how rare a bird is. So the American Birding Association, their ABA grading scale goes from a 1 to a 5, with 5 meaning that that bird is going to be extremely rare. There's going to be less than 5 records of that bird in whatever particular area you're looking at. So to touch on one of our rarest species real quick, this is the hepatic tanager. So on the right side, this bright one is the male. On the left side, the yellow one is the female. And their natural range doesn't go up into Nevada. It gets really, really close, but it's not technically in the state, so they aren't a listed species in Nevada. But there are 3 records that are supported by audio, visual, and some other evidence that the Great Basin Bird Observatory is considering, so that if they upload and kind of update their species list for the state, they might consider adding the hepatic tanager if we get a couple more records. But as you can see, they have 3, so they're going to be even more rare than what the ABA level 5 is. And then also you can look at different animals that are listed as endangered or threatened in Nevada, as they are going to be more rare just because their populations are much lower. So this is a yellow-billed cuckoo, and it is, I believe as of 2014, it was officially listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in Nevada. And just from the information I got from NDOW, it's considered a very, very rare bird. They're not super common, and I believe one of the main reasons for that is habitat destruction. So if they don't have their habitat, as we talked about in the last program, you're not going to have the animal either. So now moving on to our species highlights. The first one I'm going to talk about is a bird. I'll also be covering 2 reptiles, an amphibian, and then 1 mammal at the end. But I wanted to cover the burrowing owl just because I hear a lot of people talk about them. They're well known in the state of Nevada, but their location is not well known, and I always get asked on where to find them. And so I kind of wanted to figure this out too. So they have 38 iNaturalist observations in the state of Nevada. And as you can see, they're listed throughout the state. So they're listed in every single county in Nevada. So you should, in theory, then be able to find them in every county. You're just going to have to know where to look. And then looking at their seasonality map, you can see they're active throughout the year. There's not really a time during the year when they aren't inactive. January just means that likely someone didn't observe them then. They're still going to be active in January. It's not like they just take January off during the year. but they are going to be harder to find because they are a really small bird. So they're only about 8 ounces and they have really good camouflage, especially considering they live in quite a few different habitats. So just looking at these pictures, they can live in more drier areas where there's going to be more cactus and that type of plant life. They can live in more grassland and agricultural areas. You can also find them sometimes in urban areas as well. And then also in these kind of shrubby habitats as well that we have throughout the state. And of course, they are burrowing owls, but they do not actually burrow. So they're going to seek out burrows wherever they can get them. And in Nevada, most of the time that's going to be from species like badgers, desert tortoises, and then our ground squirrels. So burrowing owls are really lazy like other owls, and they're not going to build their own burrows. They're generally just going to steal them from other animals, or they might use different human structures for them. So they'll use different culverts and different types of piping as their burrows as well. So anything that's going to protect them and their babies during the breeding season, they'll use that. They're primarily going to be active during the day, so they are considered diurnal, but they're mainly going to be feeding around dawn and dusk, so that more crepuscular type feeding activity. And that's because they mainly are eating insects, and so generally around dawn and dusk is when insect populations are going to be out and there's going to be less competition for them. So they'll be taking advantage of that time along with the common nighthawk we mentioned earlier. But you can usually see them perching on different things like fence posts and other things so that they can get a good view of the field or whatever area they're looking at, and then they'll eventually swoop down and try to catch whatever insects are there. But they also will eat small mammals and other things too. So here's a picture just to show you. They don't necessarily pick the highest perches. So some raptors are going to prefer really high perches like on telephone poles. Burrowing owls are generally going to be a lower perching bird species. So now getting into how you can find them. So once again, they are found in every single county throughout the state. They're listed in all of them. And then based on their seasonality map, they should be active throughout the year, but they're especially going to be more observable during their breeding season, as this is when they're going to be coupling up and finding mates. They're also going to stay together once they've mated and help rear their children together. And then of course, once there's babies, that's usually a big population burst, so it's easier to see animals during that time. So like I said, they're going to pair up. Generally, the male and female are going to stick together during the breeding season. Around the burrows, generally it's the male that's going to hang out outside and guard them. So you can look for that one little burrowing owl standing out and looking on guard. Otherwise, if you can't necessarily find the burrows, you can look for their little tracks, which are kind of look like little Ks. So our burrowing owls have a zygodactyl toe configuration, so they can have their 2 toes forward and 2 toes back, and that's why they leave that little kind of K mark. Like I said, just be looking for that male, generally standing on top of the burrow mound right there, looking out, making sure there's no predators or anything that's going to mess with his burrow. And then once you get into the summertime, they're going to be having their babies. Once the babies are about 10 days old, they actually will start doing this thing where they'll just hang out around the entrance of the burrow, and they'll just be looking around and making little cute noises and stuff. They're very curious, as you can see right here. He has such a curious face. And then after a little bit more time, they're going to start fledging. So this is when birds, or baby birds, are going to be going out and flapping around on the ground and trying to strengthen their wings. That way they can eventually fly. So definitely during the summer months from around May through August would be a good time to go out and try to view the burrowing owls during their breeding season. But as the sign says, please be respectful and don't disturb owls when they are in their breeding season. Burrowing owls are especially known for being flighty, and they will abandon their nests and not come back if they are disturbed. So if you are going out to view these animals, make sure you're being as respectful as possible and maintaining distance, using things like scopes or binoculars to get a better look. But 2, once the birds have fledged, once the babies have fledged, they'll get this kind of rough, disheveled look to them, which eventually they'll become better looking and have a more sleek look like their parents. If you can't find the birds themselves, you can look for indirect evidence. So feathers are a really good form of indirect evidence for birds. You can actually upload feathers, pictures of them to iNaturalist, and people can help you identify just the feathers. You can also look for pellets. So all raptors or any bird actually that eats animals is going to produce pellets. But burrowing owls, since they're eating mostly insects, that's something you can look for that can help you identify it as a burrowing owl pellet. And then also with birds, we usually tell people to look for nests, but in their case, you're going to be looking for those burrows. And so, like I said, they do steal burrows from other animals. And so maybe if they left, another animal might take it over again. So sometimes it's hard to distinguish if it's an actual burrowing owl burrow or not. And then, as I said earlier, they can be found in urban environments. So burrowing owls, like we said, they can be in a variety of different habitats, but they also can be in urban environments. So as flighty as they are during the breeding season, they can be out throughout the year near humans, and they're not necessarily going to be as flighty. It's just during the breeding season when they are trying to keep their populations going, that's when they get more spooked. And then you can also listen for them. So of course, with all birds or most birds, you can look at their calls and their songs and try to memorize those in order to identify it. That way you don't have to see the animal, you can just hear it. So this is what their song sounds like. And then this is what their call is going to sound like, or one of their calls. All right. So now going to our Great Basin Spadefoot toad. These are one of my favorite species of toads since I've been researching them so much because they just are little flat pancake toads. I think they're really, really cute. And they're found throughout the state, so that's really cool. Amanda just told me before this video that she has found them out near Rancho San Rafael Park in Reno. So this is a really good time of year to be looking for them. And now you have a direct place you can go to. So if you want to find them, maybe go head out to Rancho San Rafael if you're in the Reno area. But otherwise, they are found throughout the state. They're listed in all of our counties, though most of their observations have occurred in this kind of central belt, kind of near Great Basin National Park-ish, the Toyobe Dome Wilderness, and then over in near kind of the Lahontan Valley Wetlands area. But they're mostly going to be found during their breeding season. So like most amphibians and reptiles in Nevada, during these colder months, they're going to be brumating, and Great Basin Spadefoot toads are a burrowing species, so they're going to be underground during these times. So you're definitely not going to be able to find them. But generally around April is when they leave brumation. So they're going to be found in a lot of shrubby kind of habitats. So just based on their name, they're found in the Great Basin Desert, which has a lot of scrubby sagebrush type habitats. So those are where you're going to be finding them. And they're also going to be primarily nocturnal. So you can see those really big eyeballs. Those are going to be used to be looking around and hunting at night, and also to help them to escape predators and other threats. But as I said earlier, in about 2017, there was a study done at Lund University in Sweden, where they actually found that frogs and toads have the best night vision out of all the animals that they studied in the world. So they have the ability to see color in absolute darkness, which most animals do not have that capability. They found that geckos and moths can still see colors in very low light, but they can't see color in absolute darkness, and our frogs and toads can. So that's really special and really, really cool. And the reason why they can do that is because of the way their rods and cones are set up. So we as humans also have rods and cones. Our cones are going to help us to see color, whereas our rods are going to help us to see more black and white when there is less light out. But for our frogs and toads, they have two sensitivities in their rods, and one allows them to see those colors even at the absolute threshold of darkness. So they have really, really impressive night vision, and therefore color vision too, based on their adaptations, and that's going to help them with finding different insects at nighttime, maybe even finding other mates. And then also, since they live in these really dark burrows, that night vision is also going to help them to escape and get around if need be. So like I said, they are a burrowing species, so they're also going to prefer habitats that have a little bit more looser soil, and they're also going to prefer habitats that have a little bit more moisture in their soil too. And they're going to have these cute little glossy black spades, which they get their name from, on their back feet, and that's going to be what's helping them to dig out those burrows. So unlike the burrowing owl, these guys will actually make their own burrows. They're not so lazy. But they're really, really, really cute. And one of the reasons why they want to live in an area with more moisture is because they have more delicate skin compared to a lot of other toads. So you can see they still have some of those little bumpy, rough spots on their backs. But compared to a lot of other toad species, they have minimal bumps, and they actually have really smooth skin. So their skin is more at risk of losing moisture. So that's partially also why they're nocturnal. They're not going to be out during the heat of the day. But also by burrowing in that moist soil, they're able to maintain the moisture levels in their skin. And then they're going to come in a variety of colors, mostly based on the habitat type they live in. So some of them are going to be more kind of this brownish, tannish color. Others will be kind of yellowy, and then some will be more white. Even still, some can have a darker brown color, even some reddish. And then there are some that are going to be that kind of stereotypical greenish frog toad color that we usually picture for these animals. So how you can find them in Nevada? Well, like we said, they are going to be found throughout the state. Even though the observations are primarily concentrated in this central belt, they still can be found throughout the rest of the state. And it's mostly going to be during their breeding season, which is from April to August. And so at this time, around April, they're usually getting out of their brumation state. So they're going to be more active because they're going to need to feed. They're also going to need to go outside and warm up a little bit. Once they've done that, they're also going to get into that breeding mode. So they're going to want to go seek out other mates, other toads. So this is when they'll be gathering more so in groups. So it might be easier to find them at this time, since it's easier to find a group of animals than just an individual. And this is also when they will undergo their seasonal movements, trying to find breeding pools or just basically any area with water. These toads are known to actually just use like puddles left over from rain. They'll use any water resources they can find, considering Nevada is the most arid state in the US. So they'll use kind of like this leftover rainwater that's just hanging out. They'll use those type of pools. You can also find them in kind of canals and irrigation ditches. So especially if you're near kind of agricultural lands, those tend to be, farmers are going to use more water. And so therefore those areas are going to be more moist. So the toads might seek out those areas. And of course they're doing this for their babies. So even if you're not going to go out and find an adult spadefoot toad, you might be able to go out and find their tadpoles or their froglets as they're developing. So they need those breeding pools because as tadpoles, they're going to be breathing underwater with their lungs, and they have this tail fin to help them swim around, which eventually they will become terrestrial, meaning they move on to land and they will develop those hind legs, which they develop their hind legs before their front legs. That's why they're so much bigger and more muscular. They put a lot more effort into those. And they're going to lose their tail and then develop lungs so that they can breathe on land. But one really cool thing, I am not good at identifying tadpoles. I have honestly never even really tried. But you can, on iNaturalist, upload pictures of tadpoles and people can identify them for you. So some people have spent time in their lives actually looking at all these different species of tadpoles and they know how to identify them. So definitely utilize that resource because sometimes you're not going to be able to find the adult toads. And so this might just be what you're left with. But otherwise, you got to just keep a close eye out. So like I said, they like more moist areas, especially during the summertime. Keep an eye on the ground because since they're toads, they're mostly just going to be hopping around down there. They can hide out in the brush and they're going to camouflage really well in there. So it's also important that you listen for them. So if you're out at nighttime, also be looking at roads. because they like to cross the roads. That's when a lot of times people see them because their headlights will hit them, but also be listening for them. So this is what they'll sound like. And that's a creepy noise, but I'm going to play it again because it's cool. So be listening for that, especially during the breeding season, because they're otherwise not going to be calling. All right, so the reptile we're going to be talking about first is a western skink, which is one of my favorite lizards. So skinks in general, I think, are really cool because they're very smooth-scaled lizards, and they just, I don't know, they kind of move more like snakes to me than other lizards. But these guys are going to be found throughout the state. Mostly they've been found near Great Basin National Park, somewhere kind of near Reno, and then down near kind of, it looks like maybe Red Rock Canyon near Las Vegas. But these lizards throughout everywhere that they live, they're known for being very secretive. So regardless of if you're in Nevada or if you're elsewhere, they're going to be really hard lizards to find because they're very secretive, they like to burrow, and then of course they're going to be brumating during part of the year, and they might be estivating during the summer as well. But as you can see, they're going to come out of brumation around April and May, and that's generally when they're going to be doing most of their activities during the year. So they're going to be out feeding, going to find partners so that they can breed, and other things like that. These guys can be found in just a variety of different habitats. So in Nevada, they're going to like kind of scrubby habitats, but they usually like ones that are near water. And again, because they're a burrowing species, being in areas with moist, loose soil, it just makes it easier for them to burrow, and it also helps maintain their moisture content in their skin. But they can also be found in grassland areas as well as meadows and woodlands, mostly just areas that are near water and that have a lot of debris and leaf litter and stuff for them to hide under. So as you can see, they are really good hiders. So sometimes they'll just hide in sticks and leaves and stuff like that. But they are a burrowing species. So they are going to create these little burrows that they'll hide in, both during the day and at nighttime, though they are going to be primarily active during the day. They are not a nocturnal species. And as you can see, one of their best field marks is this really bright blue tail that they have. Although the bright blue tails are more so going to be on the juvenile skinks, the adults tend to have duller colors compared to the juveniles. But these are really, really cool, so they can help you to identify the species, just because that blue is going to stick out than the rest of the animal's body. If you look at their brown and cream coloration, that's going to blend in really well with our landscape out here, whereas that blue might stick out a little bit more. And it definitely does to other animals that are predators of the skink, and so that is how they have developed the ability to detach their tail and also retain some autonomy. So they will detach their tail when they feel threatened and scared, especially if a predator gets a hold of them, and that way they can run away while their tail will remain there, being really bright blue. That's going to draw the predator in, and then it's going to still be able to wiggle around, and that way the predator stays interested in that tail rather than following the rest of the skink, which hopefully is able to get away, because as soon as they get away, they will survive. Their tail can regrow, and actually when it regrows, it's going to be a less bright blue color, so it's actually better for them to have to go through that process of a predator scaring them and losing their tail, because then they become better camouflage. So that's just the way it works for them. But this is what it's going to look like when that tail detaches and is still moving around. It's kind of creepy, but super useful for the skink. So now getting into how we are going to find our skinks. Well, a lot of times people think, and we talked about this earlier, that a lot of species that are solitary, they don't want to be around members of the same species necessarily. So skinks are a solitary species, but they will hang out with other species of lizards. They don't really care about that. So you can find them in areas where there will be more common lizards like blue bellies and stuff like that. So that tells you they are in those areas. They're just so secretive, they're harder to find. But looking at that map again, they're found throughout most of the state, and they're going to be primarily active during these summer kind of breeding months for them. So you can be looking for that indirect evidence in the form of burrows. So during a portion of the breeding season, the female skinks will have their eggs in their burrows and they'll maintain them in there and kind of guard them in there. So it might be harder to find them during that time because they're going to be inside. But otherwise, they might be, you know, every once in a while coming out, or if they're guarding, they might come out to investigate something. Otherwise, you can look around in leaf litter and in fallen logs, maybe even under rocks, but make sure if you're doing this and you disturb any of those things, make sure you put them back. That way you can leave no trace and try to disturb the habitat as least as possible. So even though losing that tail can be a kind of sad process, it can also be an indirect sign of these lizards. So you can find their detached tails out in the wild. There were a couple iNaturalist observations where they just happened to find the tail. Otherwise, you can still find attached tails. So sometimes when they're going into their burrows, they'll leave this little tail kind of hanging out. That might be a good way to find them since that's the brightest part of their body than out in the open. But also these lizards are able to climb. So you shouldn't only be looking at the ground, you should also be looking up and around you because especially on rocky surfaces or more textured surfaces, they're really good climbers. And then with a lot of reptiles, some of the best times to view them is during the early morning when it starts heating up and then into the early afternoon, as that's when our reptiles are going to be out basking. And skinks are going to do this, of course, because they're cold-blooded like the rest. So they need that sunlight in order to heat up their bodies so that they can be active throughout the day. So definitely be looking for them out, especially near areas that have this kind of lush vegetation, near areas of water. They're primarily going to be out there, so just look on boardwalks. You can look at different concrete structures. Anywhere where they can get out and get a good sunbathe, they'll do it. Otherwise, as with our previous species, you just got to keep a close eye out. So if you're out hiking or just doing something outside, make sure to look around on the ground, in the leaf litter. Also, our skinks are going to be hiding up in the rocks too, so just keep an eye out and be as observant as possible. So then the last reptile we'll talk about is our western threadsnake, which has a whopping 0 iNaturalist observations in Nevada. But I think they're really cool, and they are listed under the 2013 Nevada Department of Wildlife Action Plan. So they have part of their natural range that gets into the very, very southern part of Nevada. So they're a very desert adapted snake. And that means that therefore, since they're in the warmer portion of the United States, they're not going to brumate for as long as other snakes, especially snakes that live more in the northern half of Nevada. So these guys definitely, you're going to be able to find them more so because they're not brumating, but they're going to be really, really hard because they're super, super secretive. So getting into that, one of the reasons why they're hard to find is they look pretty much very similar to earthworms, and they're easily mistaken with them. But the ways you can tell them apart, they're not going to have segmented bodies like our earthworms do. They're also not going to have that more wet feeling to them. They're still going to be, they have some moisture, but they're not going to be as wet as our earthworms. You can see their individual scales too, which are going to be really smooth to help them with burrowing. And then also one of their main identification features is these 2 false eyes on top of their head. So we call these vestigial, meaning they used to serve a function, but they don't anymore. So this snake species has adapted to living underground where it isn't going to be using its eyesight. So those eyes are no longer used, but they still have those 2 spots on the top of their head. So it's going to be a really hard snake to find because they are really small and they blend in really well with their environment. So as you can see in this picture, hidden in all this kind of dried, skinny vegetation, they're able to hide out. And then they also are going to be burrowers. So they're going to prefer areas that are going to have that moist, kind of loose soil again. They're also going to prefer areas that have more rocks and are more desertous and brushy too. But they're going to be living the majority of their lives underground, so that's going to make them really hard to find. One of the cool adaptations that they have for their burrowing lifestyle, which also can be used to identify them, they have this tiny little spine at the very end of their little blunt tail, and that way they can grab onto the ground and give themselves kind of a better position while they're burrowing, give themselves some leverage. They're going to come in a variety of different colors, which I thought was really, really cool. They have all these really pretty colors, and they're all really shiny too, which I thought was really neat. So they can be really dark in color, like this more blackish color. They can be more pink and kind of silvery, as well as closer to white. And even there's some that are more purpley too. And these snakes are really, really skinny. So just looking at this next picture compared to this, I believe probably wedding band, this snake is really, really skinny. So they're actually so skinny that they can fit within the tunnels of ant colonies and termite colonies, and that's how they're gonna feed. So they're gonna track them using their pheromone trails that the ants and termites leave behind. So they're using their sense of smell, and then they're going to go into those little colonies and just eat them from the inside out, basically. Another picture to help you get some scale on how big this snake is. So they can get pretty long at about 1.5 feet, but they're still going to be really, really skinny, and they tend to wrap themselves up. So they also are called ribbon snakes because they kind of resemble just ribbons that have been kind of rolled up. But these are their eggs right here, which are really weird looking compared to other snake eggs. Most are going to be more round, but theirs are really, really oval. And most of the time, they're only going to produce 1 egg per year, and that's just because they're so tiny. So to get a reference on their size compared to their egg, this egg is about the size of a long grain of rice. So that tells you just how tiny this species actually is, and that makes it that much harder to find, besides the fact that it has such a secretive lifestyle. But they're really, really cute, so we should go out and try to find them. So once again, they're going to be found in that really, really far southern portion of the state where it's going to be the most desertous, the warmest down there, and that's the type of habitat they like, that has rocks, that's really hot, but still is going to have some loose soil for them to burrow in. And since they live in a warmer portion of the United States, they're not going to brumate for as long, so that is a good sign, though they do spend the majority of their lives underground. So basically, you're going to have to get lucky in terms of finding them above ground, which can happen. So if you're out at nighttime especially, these snakes are mostly going to be nocturnal when they are active above ground, and that way they can stay out of the heat of the day, they can avoid certain predators, and then also they're not going to lose that moisture content in their skin. But they are going to be really hard to find, since sometimes they'll just kind of barely cover parts of their body with soil, especially if they detect something coming. A lot of burrowing snakes will just kind of get a nice sifting layer of soil over them to cover them up just enough to stay hidden. So you're going to have to keep a really close eye out, but since they have that kind of shiny skin, that reflects the light back a lot of times when you're out there. So using flashlight and looking for that kind of flash back can maybe be helpful. Like I said, they're easily mistaken as earthworms, even in death. So looking at this dried out, flattened thread snake, you might not be able to tell at first that it is a Western thread snake. So you'll have to try to find those 2 false eyes and that little tiny spine on their tail. And maybe you can identify them that way, but also if you look, they don't have the segments like the earthworms do, though they do look like a little crunchy earthworm jerky, so they're very similar. You can also look for their sheds though, and those look really, really pretty. They're really shiny because they have that iridescent quality to their scales, and so they kind of end up looking like chainmail. So if you can find indirect evidence like that, that's really, really cool. And then, as I said, sometimes it's just going to be random luck. So randomly you can find them out during the day. And like I said, animals will do that for a variety of reasons. They'll kind of diverge from their normal activity patterns if there's more resources. Sometimes if it's breeding season, they'll do that as well. Which also during their breeding season, the females will actually gather in colonies, nesting colonies. So that might be a better time to go look for them, since they'll be in a group and not on their own. But also you might just have random occurrences like this. So someone found I believe a California king snake And when they found it, it was eating a western threadsnake. So they were able to find it because someone else found it first. So you just got to keep an eye out for things like that. All right, so the last animal we are going to talk about is the only mammal we're talking about, the ringtail, which is also called a ringtail cat or a miner's cat or a civet cat. But actually these animals are not cats. They're actually more closely related to raccoons, which are more closely related to dogs than they are cats. But they were called cats because when miners came into Nevada, they had a lot of mice and rats down in their mine shafts, and so they used these animals to go and catch the mice, which is similar to what we've used cats for before. So that's why they have that association with cat. And they do kind of look cat-like a little bit. They're going to be found mostly in the southern portion of the state, though they have been seen up near Great Basin National Park. Most of our iNaturalist observations have been down near Vegas, with some being really close to like downtown Vegas. So this is a species that's not necessarily always going to be out in the wilderness. You can actually view them closer to urban areas as well. But funny enough, this animal is not really observed during the warmer months, so kind of opposite of what the other species we've been talking about. But that's because during the colder months, they're going to be a little bit more active during the daytime since temperatures are more favorable, and then also generally, when it gets to fall and winter time, they have a seasonal shift in diet where they prefer to eat small mammals in the winter. And since those are going to be active more so during the day, they're going to be hunting more so during the day. So you can see them more so kind of in the colder months of the year. But they are going to prefer mostly just habitats where they can climb. So they are really great climbers. They like areas that have trees. They like areas that have canyons and cliffs. And they also seem to be somewhat attached to riparian zones, or at least habitats that are near water, which is very similar to their raccoon relatives. So not necessarily surprising. But they are a really, really tiny animal. They're only about 1 to 2 pounds. And their tail is going to make up more than half of their body length. And that's a really cool feature that is pretty common in animals that are climbers, as it's going to provide more balance and it's going to make it easier for them to maneuver. You can also see they've got really, really big, cute eyes that are going to take in as much light as possible when they're out hunting at nighttime. Unlike raccoons, they're going to have a white mask though. And that's because ringtails are a little bit smaller, so they do have more predators than our raccoons do. So things like bobcats and coyotes and great horned owls especially will eat them. So they actually have this white eye mask to try to mimic and act like they have really big eyeballs. So that white is supposed to look like the white of the eyes, and then their dark eye is just supposed to be the pupil. So it kind of makes it look like they're much bigger than they are. That way, if a predator comes and approaches them at nighttime, they're kind of tricked into thinking they have those really big, scary eyes, and that predator's then gonna run away and not want to mess with the ringtail anymore. You can also see they have these really cute big ears that are also going to be used at nighttime when they're hunting. So similar to those desert kit foxes, they're gonna have kind of a cup shape to them. They're gonna be facing forward. That way they're taking in the sounds that are in front of them. And then they're also gonna have these little whiskers that'll help them to feel around and sense different vibrations and things like that. But mostly they're going to be out and about climbing at nighttime in the trees, up in the rocks, doing different things like that. So you can see just based on their body shape, they're really elongated animals and they're really, really skinny. So they sometimes have been described as looking like a really slim fox. And that's just to help them to get through and maneuver through the branches and the rocks and all these tight spaces in their habitats. And they're gonna have a lot of really cool adaptations having to do with their feet since they're climbers. So we talked about some of the adaptations that porcupines and like the pine marten had in the previous program. The ringtail is gonna be somewhat similar. So they're gonna have actually 5 toes that are gonna allow them to have a better grip when they're climbing. They also have semi-retractable claws. So when they are climbing up things like trees, they can actually bring their claws out a little bit more to give them a better grip. And they're also going to have these really flexible toes that can grab onto things and hold themselves up. And then of course, they're also going to use that tail. So as you can see here, this ringtail is kind of hanging down with the majority of its body weight being lower than it, but that tail is sticking straight out and is able to hold it up and keep it balanced while it's in this really weird position. And then like our raccoons, they have very flexible wrists. So their back feet can actually rotate 180 degrees. And that way they can climb down things head first. So that's a really cool adaptation they have too. And then some cool rock climbing techniques they use. They've been known to use ricocheting as well as stemming. So ricocheting, if you look over at this picture, if you imagine the ringtail kind of being on this side, it would just kind of jump from side to side and like ping pong itself along the different rock walls. And then stemming is kind of what they're doing and what this ringtail is doing here, where they're forcing pressure on one side and on the other side. That way they can make their way up the rocks. So you can see right here, it's really helpful to be so elongated and skinny for this animal in order to get around in its habitat. And then of course that tail again, so very characteristic, similar to its raccoon relative, that white and black banding. And that's mainly going to be helping them when they are climbing and maintaining their balance. But they can also do this really cool thing. I couldn't find a video of it, but apparently they can use this tail as a way, like a prop, so that they can cartwheel out of situations with different predators. So they can use that tail as like an extra limb in order to help them maneuver and outmaneuver different predators, especially great horned owls. So now getting into how to find them. So like we said, they're found in the southern portion of the state, and a lot of the times they are going to be more active when we are active in the colder months. So in the warmer months, they're going to be more nocturnal, and then when it gets cooler and the temperatures are more favorable and their prey are going to be active during the day, they're going to be active during the day as well. So one form of indirect evidence you can look for, of course, is poop or scat. So like I said, these ringtails go through seasonal shifts in diet. So during the summer, they're primarily going to be focusing on insects and also food products, so seeds and berries, things like that, which is also very similar to the raccoon's diet. So during those months, you're going to have to look for poop that's going to have different plant products like seeds and pits, and also little shiny bits from the exoskeletons of insects. Whereas in the winter months, they're eating those small mammals, so more so there's going to be just bones and maybe some fur in those poop. You can also look for those tracks. So since they have those feet that are really well adapted for climbing, they're pretty distinct compared to other species. So one of the things that is distinct is they're going to have 5 toes. So ringtails are pretty similar in terms of their track size to house cats, but I'll show you in the next picture how to differentiate them. And one of the ways is that ringtails are going to have 5 toe pads, whereas house cats are going to only have 4. And then they're also going to have this little extra pad at the bottom of their foot, which is called the carpal pad. And cats aren't going to have that either. So they'll have that carpal pad as well as these 5 toes. And then they have semi-retractable claws, but for the most part, they are not going to be leaving claw marks, as are not cats, because they have fully retractable claws. But you can see, so they have that little extra carpal pad down there. And then the cat is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 toe pads, whereas the ringtail has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But this little one, sometimes it doesn't show up as well in the tracks. So that can be, make it more difficult to identify them, but you can just upload track pictures to iNaturalist and people can help you identify those as well. So now, another thing to note is just that ringtails can be found in urban areas. So think about raccoons and what their behavior is like. Ringtails are not as urban as raccoons, but they're still similar in that they're really curious animals, and they're going to seek out places where there's a lot of food and where there's water. So a lot of times that's going to be in urban areas around humans. So you can look for them kind of climbing up on different fences and balconies and other structures. There are some iNaturalist observations where they got locked in somebody's garage or things like that. Especially if you have cat food or dog food that you leave out or any other attractants. Ringtails, like raccoons, they're going to come and eat that, and they're going to keep coming back. So make sure you're not leaving out those attractants. That way they don't become too reliant on unnatural foods. And then also, I don't know why, some animals are curious enough that they will try to get into your house, but for the most part, I would think ringtails won't. But they will be in urban areas, so just make sure you keep your eyes out, especially at nighttime. And then also keep your ears open, because I believe it's around June is when ringtails are going to have their babies, so during the summer months, and they're going to make these cute little noises that you can hear. So you can also listen for them in addition to just looking for them or their indirect evidence. All right, so we are nearing the end of this program. And the main conclusions I want you to get from this is just that elusive species have certain activity patterns that are going to be inconvenient for us, but they are necessary for our animal survival. So even though it makes it harder for us to view them, it's going to be the best thing possible for those animals, as that's what they're best adapted to. And then yet again, back to our main theme that Nevada is a really diverse state, but its diversity is going to be harder to observe. And that's why we're doing this program, to get into why our animals are so difficult to observe. So our final elusive program is going to be on Friday, June 19th at 5 p.m. I'm going to be covering more species, and in that program, I'm going to be focusing on physical traits in terms of adaptations. So activity patterns are generally regarded as more behavioral adaptations. So this one, we're going to be focusing on the physical traits and physical adaptations that our animals have. Make sure if you're going out in the upcoming weeks, that you're going out and responsibly recreating. So make sure you're just going out and respecting nature and other people as well. If you want to view our past programs, you can go to NV Depth of Wildlife YouTube. So it's not Nevada Department of Wildlife, it's going to be just like this. And you can go to our playlists and then go to our webinars. And we will have a playlist that'll have all of the webinars that have been uploaded thus far. I believe Oxbow After Dark is the last one that's been uploaded. Hopefully within the next week, we can get more up from the last month. That way you guys can go back and view those if you want.
All right, so our first question is, can ringtail cats harm humans?
So any animal can harm humans, basically. All animals are going to have teeth. Most of them are going to have claws, or at least some type of nail. So any animal can hurt humans, including ringtails. The best way to keep that from happening is don't disturb them. So if you're going to go out looking for ringtails, make sure you're maintaining distance, especially if you're going out to view animals during their breeding season. That tends to be when they can get more aggressive, and they're more likely to defend themselves against humans. So definitely just make sure you're maintaining distance and let that animal know that you're respecting it and you're not going to be bugging it, and that you shouldn't have any problems with ringtails or any other animals.
All right, and then our next question is, how common are hummingbirds in Reno?
I would say they're pretty common. I mean, I think there's at least 3 species that are going to be in Reno either while they're migrating or while they're breeding or during certain parts of the year. I think just a couple weeks ago, I saw my first black-chinned hummingbird that was coming through, and it was just feeding on the flowers in my backyard. So they're definitely going to be more common if you have those attractants. So if you have flowers planted, if you have hummingbird feeders out, things like that, you'll definitely see more of them.
Yeah, we definitely get them from like March into about September. So our next question is, so this one's kind of a technical question. So
Okay.
iNaturalist, what constitutes an observation? Someone says that they were out on Wednesday and they heard some strange sounds, so they followed them to the source and recorded them. They ended up flushing a grouse of some kind, and they identified the bird as a sooty grouse. They don't have a picture. They didn't catch it during the flush, but the call was distinct. So would they still be able to put this in as an observation?
Yes, so I believe that you can go on and upload video evidence, and you can upload audio evidence on iNaturalist as well. I'm not sure if you can do that from the app, or maybe you have to go through the website, because I haven't done that before. But I do know that you can do that. So you should try to upload that audio evidence. If not to iNaturalist, you can send it out to other different apps that, like eBird, for example, and people can try to help you with it on there as well.
All right, and our next question is, how many more webinars are you going to do?
So me specifically, I have the one more elusive animal program after this one. And then after that, I'm not really sure what programs I'm going to do. So if you have any suggestions, not only in regards to this program, so like give me feedback on that and what I can do better specifically with this one, but also if you have any ideas of things you would want me to cover over the rest of the summer, definitely keep those, send those in with your review as well. And that way I can kind of get better ideas on what you guys actually want to be hearing and not necessarily just me talking all the time.
All right, here's a good question. Does iNaturalist identify humans?
I don't think that you can upload humans up there, though you can upload, I feel like house cats you can upload. You can upload like domestic goats. So there's weird animals that you can upload, but not humans, unfortunately. There would probably be some really funny pictures if we could.
All right, and it looks like that was our last question.
Perfect. All right, so before everybody heads out, yet again, here is the list of upcoming programs. I believe not in regards to me, but in regards to our other educators, they will be doing more programs, and some of them will be repeats of ones that we've already done. So if you missed out on a program before, you might be able to see it again. Just make sure you're checking in with our upcoming events on Facebook. But yeah, otherwise, if you have any specific topics you want to hear about, make sure you're including those in the reviews that you submit after you watch these webinars. That way we know. All right, do we have any more questions, Amanda?
Thank yous.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you all for attending. I hope to see you next week at our final Elusive Animal webinar. But yeah, in the meantime, go outside, enjoy the outdoors. Hopefully you can find some of these animals. If you do, feel free to send me like an email. My email is endow2.americorps@gmail.com. I would love to see if you are able to find some of these animals that I'm talking about. But otherwise, have a great weekend and great week, and hopefully I'll see you next Friday.